Welcome back. The second project for this bedroom is to soundproof the party wall with a Reducto Wool clip and rail system. If like me you live in a terraced or semi-detached house, taking on this project will greatly reduce what you hear from your neighbours, which in our case is sorely needed. We're going to break this down into 6 steps as we build up the layers, the first of which is Reducto Clips. These will hold the metal furring bars to which the plasterboard attaches. The foam on the backside decouples the metal bracket from the wall, reducing vibrations from transferring to the rest of the system. The fixing points are also isolated with high density rubber, which is strong enough to hold the screws in place. To work out how many you need, the widest apart they can be horizontally is 1200mm and vertically 600mm, so my wall required a 5x5 configuration. The top row should be around 150mm to the centre of the clips from the ceiling, and the bottom row about 100mm up from the floor. As the plaster had come away in places where I'd removed the skirting, I had to set the bottom rows slightly higher. However, this bottom row has a plug socket in the way, so before I started drilling, I took the floorboard up to make sure that the wires were coming from below, which they were, rather than across the wall. To help with this project, I've treated myself to a laser level, which you guys have been telling me I should get since I started this channel. And of course you were right all along, it's great. The clips don't have to be perfectly aligned vertically, but as the bars go across horizontally, the clips do need to be level with one another, and the laser really helps with this. I marked out the fixing points with an awl, drilled with a 6mm masonry bit, pushed in the raw plugs, and attached the clips with some 5x60mm screws. The next step is to attach the metal furring bars by simply pinching and slotting them into the clips. I alternated which side I started from, making sure the ends were a good 5 to 10mm short of the adjoining walls to stop sound from travelling through those walls and back into the furring bars. To complete the rows, I cut the rest of the bars to length with tin snips. Ideally, the 2 channels should overlap by 150mm, and to connect them, I'm using self-tapping stitcher screws, which are made to tie together metal. The head on them does protrude a little, but this doesn't make any practical difference when attaching plasterboard. You can see that there's a finger's breadth gap behind the bars, and so totally decoupled from the wall. Before I could attach the bottom bar, I had the socket to sort out. I'm determined to get better at electrics, as I always feel like it gets in the way of the mechanical stuff that I enjoy. So I'm going to attempt to move this one, but take what I say with a pinch of salt, as I'm not an electrician. With the floorboard already up, I found that I had some slack which I was able to pull through the wall conduit, with the electrics turned off at the consumer unit of course. The new socket will be slightly higher to avoid the furring bar, and so the cables will come into contact with the metal, which, if the white sheath on the wire deteriorates, runs the risk of electrifying the bar and any screws going into it. So I'm not showing it here, but it's in the regs to slip a conduit over the top to protect the wire from the metal. Next up, 25mm acoustic mineral wool. It has a greater density than other wools, which adds mass and helps with the absorption of sound and stops sound from reverberating in the cavity between the existing wool and the plasterboard. This stuff is like putting your hands in an ant nest, so do wear gloves. It does cut easily though with a Stanley knife, and I'm using contact spray adhesive to stick it to the wall. Something to be aware of is apparently the wool shouldn't touch the furring bars, and I probably went a little bit closer than I should in places. Now after this stage I won't be able to see the furring bars anymore, so I made a mark on the 2 adjoining walls at the middle point of the bars so I can locate them later on. Next up, plasterboard. For this I'm using 15mm acoustic plasterboard, which is denser than the normal stuff. The walls of this room are around 2.5 meters high, so a full 2.4 meter board won't cover them. I had to cut the plasterboard to come up to the midpoint of the second highest furring bar so that I had 2 fixing points for the plasterboard at the top. I started from the left side and cut out the location for the socket. Again, we want the plasterboard to not be touching the walls, ceiling or floor. Even though I'd used my packers in my last project, I'd just misplaced them somewhere, and so I used some hardboard I had to keep it off the floor, and I did the sides and the ceiling by eye. I'm using 25mm stitcher screws again, but these have a head that sinks flush with the plasterboard, just like a drywall screw. Now to get the screws in the centre of the boards, I just had to use the laser level to line up the marks I'd made on either side, and then move it up a row as I went along. Pretty neat. Any little gaps around the board I filled with Acoustic Sealant. More on this later. We're not done yet, we've got another layer of plasterboard to add, but between the layers I'm adding something called Tecsound, which is a dense visco-elastic rubber. If you've ever lifted a rubber roof, it's that kind of heavy. It's self-adhesive, the back paper just peels off. The front has a non-removable plastic which overlaps, which I imagine is for creating a vapor barrier if needed. Again, it's easily cut with the Stanley knife. I had to cut it into shorter pieces as I was doing it on my own for the most part. I started at the top of the wall and peeled off the backing paper for the top 6 inches or so, stuck it on, and then I could work my way down and across the wall. One thing you can do is make sure the joints are offset from the joints in the plasterboard underneath. The piece I cut out for the socket I stuck to the back wall, because why not, it might help, and then I cut out some wings either side which will allow me to secure the socket in the final step. You'll want to get the Tecsound as close together as possible, but where I had little gaps I again filled these with Acoustic Sealant. So what are the alternatives to Tecsound? Well, I've used green glue before, which like Tecsound is viscoelastic and should remain so. It's just squirted on, which makes it very easy. Another option is mass-loaded vinyl. I haven't put in the research to really say which of these is best, but my guess is that the Tecsound adds way more mass than the green glue and is more elastic than the mass-loaded vinyl, so it seemed to be a good option. Final layer of plasterboard. This time I'm starting from the right side, again to offset as much as I can from the first layer of plasterboard. This layer also needs to have a gap around all the edges. Because the Tecsound is covering all the screws from the first layer of plasterboard, I'm totally blind on the locations of the furring bars, so this is where the marks I made earlier and the laser level really comes into its own and makes this process a doddle. Using the vertical laser line also helps keep the boards plumb as my floor isn't perfectly level. For the socket, I'm using a 35mm dry lining back box, threaded the cables through, and could push out the flaps behind this last layer of plasterboard to secure it. I could then rewire and screw the faceplate back on. Obviously this is a bit of a weak spot in the wall in regards to sound, so you can get acoustic putty pads that mould to the inside of the back box, so I might pick up one when I can. Final touch is to smear some acoustic sealant between the plasterboard, and this time all around the edges as well. It's the same stuff I used when sealing my vapor barrier in my garden room and remains flexible, which in this case helps with absorbing sound and helps bridge the gap between the new wall and the adjoining ones ready to be plastered. So for this project, I got all the materials bar the rule plugs and the screws from a company called SoundProofingStore. They have a video, which I'll link in the description, where Phil, who I spoke to on the phone, goes through all these steps with a bit more detail on the soundproofing properties of each layer. This isn't sponsored or anything, but I thought they were excellent. You could probably source the individual materials separately for a little bit less, but they delivered everything together, which just makes things so much easier. They're not the only supplier though, and I've done a similar job on a ceiling before with Genie clips and resilient bars. I made an Instagram video of this to a jaunty tune, but I've lost the original footage, so you'll have to watch on my phone instead. So what I like about the Reducto clips I used is that they have a thinner profile, so I only lost about 60mm of floor space overall, and also they accommodate wider metal bars, which makes finding them with screws a lot easier. I haven't really delved into the science of how sound transmits, but for what it's worth, this system provides a sound reduction of 55 decibels, which is supposedly good for cancelling out music, dogs barking, or in our case, a kid screaming at his Xbox. It's worked really well, so I'm pleased, and while I won't bother with the future bathroom wall, I intend to do the same to the living room when I get to it. I think there's some good takeaways here for music studios or workshops where you might not want to go to the length or cost of building a room within a room system. This seems like a good alternative, and when attached to timber studs, the sound reduction increases to 60 decibels. Recently I got chatting to a site developer of one of the largest housing developers in the UK, and apparently they dot and dab a single layer of acoustic plasterboard to each side of the party wall, and that does the job, but this system should go way beyond that, even though it's only applied to one side. Okay, that's the first two projects done in this room. Should you take them on? Well, if your room is incredibly cold or noisy, then yeah. But if you're in a 5 to 10 year house, you're unlikely to get your money back when you sell because buyers tend to look at cosmetics with very little interest in U values or noise reduction. But for a 10-year plus house, I think they're very worthwhile improvements, regardless of whether you eventually get the money back on them. Next time, I'll be attempting to upcycle these wardrobes, so I'll catch you then. Thank you for watching. Please do consider subscribing if you enjoyed this video, and happy DIYing.